In the heart of rural Ohio, where Amish communities have thrived for generations, a devastating blizzard strikes without warning. When 50-year-old Amish farmer Samuel Miller discovers two small children, 10-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Jacob, playing dangerously in the storm, his simple act of bringing them to safety unveils a heart-wrenching story that will change not just their lives, but an entire community forever. What starts as a rescue mission becomes a journey of love, loss, healing, and the true meaning of family that transcends all boundaries. February 14, 23 started like any other winter day in Holmes County, Ohio, but it would end as a day that forever changed the lives of everyone involved. The National Weather Service had issued severe weather warnings for the region, predicting a historic blizzard with winds reaching up to 70 miles per hour and temperatures. However, in the traditional Amish community of Walnut Creek, where modern technology and emergency alerts are absent from daily life, the approaching storm remained largely unknown until it was too late to prepare adequately. Samuel Miller, a 50-year-old Amish farmer, had lived through countless harsh Ohio winters during his lifetime. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of 5 decades spent working the land, following the seasons, and living according to the simple principles of his faith. His graying beard, neatly trimmed in the traditional Amish style, framed a face that had seen both joy and profound sorrow. Samuel lived alone in his modest farmhouse, a reality that had become his norm over the past 3 years since losing his beloved wife Mary to cancer. Their only son, David, had chosen to leave the Amish community when he turned 18, embracing the English world and cutting all ties with his father and their way of life. The farmhouse where Samuel lived reflected the simple, functional beauty typical of Amish home. Handcrafted wooden furniture filled the rooms, each piece made with care and built to last generations. Quilts sewn by Mary during their 25 years of marriage provided warmth and color throughout the modest dwelling. A wood-burning stove as the heart of the home, its steady heat and gentle crackling providing comfort during the long winter months. On the mantel above the stove sat a single photograph, carefully preserved and treasured. It showed Samuel, Mary, and young David during happier times, their faces bright with the contentment that comes from a life lived in harmony with faith and community. As evening approached on that fateful February day, Samuel noticed the wind beginning to pick up outside his kitchen window. The bare branches of the old oak tree in his yard swayed more vigorously than usual, and the temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly. He moved through his evening routine of checking the animals, securing any loose items around the property, and ensuring he had adequate firewood stocked for the night. The kerosene lamps cast a warm golden glow throughout the house as darkness settled over the countryside, but outside nature was preparing to unleash its fury. By 8 p.m. that evening, the storm had arrived with a vengeance that surprised even Samuel, despite his decades of experience with Ohio weather. The wind howled around the farmhouse with an intensity that shook the very foundations of the sturdy structure. Snow didn't just fall, it attacked horizontally, driven by winds that seemed determined to bury everything in their path. The temperature plummeted so quickly that Samuel could actually feel the cold seeping through the walls of his well-built home, despite the roaring fire in his wood stove. What Samuel couldn't have known as he battened down for what he assumed would be a long but manageable night was that approximately half a mile away, 2 small children were struggling for their lives against the very storm he was weathering from the safety of his home. 10-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Jacob had been walking for nearly 3 hours through increasingly treacherous conditions. Their inadequate clothing no match for the brutal assault of wind, snow, and sub-zero temperatures. The children's story began days earlier and hundreds of miles away, though the full details of their journey would only emerge gradually. Emma, with her blonde hair and bright blue eyes, possessed the innocent trust that children her age naturally carry, believing that her older brother could handle any situation that arose. Jacob, barely 2 years her senior, but carrying the weight of responsibility that circumstances had thrust upon his young shoulders, had promised to keep his sister safe, no matter what challenges they faced. The boy had the determined look of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, his brown eyes holding a seriousness that seemed far too mature for his 12 years. Their thin winter coats, suitable perhaps for a brief walk to school or church, provided virtually no protection against the savage blizzard that had overtaken their desperate journey. Emma's small hands had long since lost feeling, her fingers too numb to properly grip Jacob's hand, though she tried desperately to maintain contact with her only anchor in the whiteout conditions. Jacob himself was fighting hypothermia, though he didn't understand the medical term for what was happening to his body. He only knew that he was getting weaker with each step, and that Emma was depending on him to find them shelter and safety. The children had been walking along what they hoped was a road, though the blizzard had erased all familiar landmarks and made navigation nearly impossible. Jacob tried to follow fence lines when he could find them, reasoning that fences led to farms, and farms meant people who might help them. Emma stumbled frequently, her legs heavy and uncoordinated from cold and exhaustion. But each time she fell, Jacob helped her back to her feet, whispering encouragements that he hoped would keep both their spirits up. Back in his farmhouse, Samuel was adding another log to his fire when he heard something that made him pause mid-motion. Above the constant roar of the wind, there was another sound, faint, intermittent, but distinctly human. He set down the log and moved closer to his front window, pressing his ear against the cold glass and straining to listen. The sound came again, and this time Samuel was certain somewhere out in that deadly storm, someone was calling for help. Without a moment's hesitation, Samuel began pulling on his heavy winter gear. His thick wool coat, waterproof boots, warm hat and heavy gloves were designed for the harsh realities of Amish farm life. But even with proper clothing, venturing out into conditions like these was extremely dangerous. The Amish belief in helping those in need, however, left no room for debate or hesitation. If someone was out there in the storm, Samuel would find them, regardless of the personal risk involved. The moment Samuel opened his front door, the full power of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow. Snow swirled into his entryway as wind-driven ice crystals stung his exposed face. The temperature differential was so extreme that his breath created clouds of vapor that were immediately swept away by the howling wind. Visibility was virtually zero. Samuel could barely see his own barn, which stood less than 50 feet from his front door. Calling out into the storm, Samuel began making his way in the direction from which he thought the sounds had come. Each step was a struggle, as he sank knee-deep into rapidly accumulating snowdrifts. The wind was so strong that it actually pushed against him, making forward progress difficult and exhausting. Every few steps he would stop and listen, trying to pinpoint the location of whoever was out there in the darkness and cold. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, Samuel finally spotted them, two small figures huddled together against a fence post, barely visible in the swirling snow. As he got closer, he could see that one child had collapsed into the snow, while the other, slightly larger figure was desperately trying to shield the smaller one with his own body. The sight filled Samuel with both urgency and admiration. Even in these dire circumstances, the older child was trying to protect the younger one. Jacob looked up as Samuel approached, his face a mixture of hope, fear, and desperation. The boy's lips were blue from cold, and his whole body was shaking uncontrollably, but his eyes still held determination. Emma lay motionless in his arms, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Samuel immediately recognized the signs of severe hypothermia, and knew that time was running out for both children, but especially for the little girl. Scooping Emma into his strong arms, Samuel was alarmed by how light and cold she felt. The child was barely conscious, her body temperature dangerously low. Jacob struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady, but his will strong. Samuel quickly assessed that while both children were in serious danger from exposure, they were still alive, and that meant there was hope. The journey back to Samuel's farmhouse was treacherous and exhausting. Carrying Emma while guiding Jacob through the blizzard required every ounce of Samuel's strength and experience. The wind seemed even stronger on the return trip, as if nature itself was trying to prevent him from saving these two small lives. Jacob stumbled several times, his coordination compromised by the cold, but each time Samuel helped him back up, offering words of encouragement and assurance that safety was just ahead. When they finally reached the farmhouse, Samuel didn't waste time with questions or explanations. Getting the children warm and stable was the immediate priority. He carried Emma directly to the living room and placed her on the sofa closest to the wood stove, while Jacob collapsed into a nearby chair, his small body still shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. Samuel immediately began the careful process of treating hypothermia, starting with removing the children's wet outer clothing and wrapping them in the warm quilts that Mary had made years earlier. Emma's condition was particularly concerning. She remained largely unresponsive, her breathing shallow and her pulse weak. Samuel had seen hypothermia before in both humans and animals, and he knew that warming had to be gradual to avoid shock to the system. He prepared warm, not hot, liquids, and began the patient process of helping the children's bodies return to normal temperature. Jacob, though in better condition than his sister, was still dangerously cold and showed signs of frostbite on his fingers and toes. As the children began to warm up and their immediate medical crisis stabilized, Samuel finally had the opportunity to really look at them and consider the questions that had been forming in his mind since finding them in the storm. These were not local children. Samuel knew every family in the surrounding Amish community, and these two were definitely not from the area. Their clothing, while inadequate for the conditions they had endured, was not Amish-made. More puzzling still was the question of what they had been doing out in such weather, apparently alone and on foot, miles from the nearest town. The hours that followed the rescue were filled with quiet tension and careful ministrations as Samuel worked to save the two children who had literally appeared out of the storm. Emma remained unconscious for nearly 2 hours after being brought inside, her small body fighting to recover from the severe hypothermia that had nearly claimed her life. Samuel sat beside her throughout the night, checking her pulse regularly, adjusting the quilts to maintain her body temperature, and offering silent prayers for her recovery. Jacob, though in better physical condition, watched his sister with an intensity that spoke of deep love and responsibility that seemed far too heavy for such young shoulders. As dawn approached and the blizzard finally began to subside, Emma's eyes fluttered open for the first time since Samuel had found them. Her gaze was unfocused, initially, darting around the unfamiliar room with the confusion and fear that comes from waking in a strange place. When her eyes finally settled on Jacob, who was sleeping in the chair beside her, she tried to sit up quickly, panic evident in her expression. Samuel, who had been dozing lightly in his own chair, immediately moved to reassure. The gentleness in Samuel's voice and manner seemed to calm Emma somewhat, though she remained obviously frightened and disoriented. Jacob woke at the sound of his sister's movements, and the relief that flooded his young face was unmistakable. The bond between these two children was clearly extraordinary. They communicated with looks and gestures that spoke of shared experiences and mutual dependence that went far beyond typical sibling relationships. Samuel prepared a simple breakfast of warm oatmeal, fresh bread, and milk, foods that would be gentle on stomachs that had been empty for too long. As the children ate, he observed them carefully, noting details that added to his growing list of questions about their circumstances. Both children ate with the rapid, focused intensity of people who had experienced real hunger, not just the temporary appetite that comes from skipping a single meal. They were polite but wary, thanking him for the food but maintaining a watchful distance that suggested they had learned not to trust adults too readily. The children's clothing told its own story. While clean and reasonably well maintained, it was clearly second-hand and showed signs of hardware. Emma's shoes were too large for her feet, stuffed with newspaper to make them fit better. Jacob's coat had been repaired multiple times, with patches that didn't quite match the original fabric. These were not children from a prosperous family, and their possessions suggested they had been traveling light, carrying only the most essential items. When Samuel finally felt it was appropriate to ask direct questions about their situation, he approached the subject with the careful sensitivity of someone who understood that children in crisis needed to feel safe before they could share their truth. Jacob, clearly the spokesperson for the pair, initially provided only the most basic information. They were brother and sister. Their last name was Thompson, and they had been walking to find their aunt, who lived somewhere in Ohio. When Samuel pressed gently for more details, where had they come from? Why were they traveling alone? Where exactly did their aunt live? Jacob's answers became vague and evasive. The story Jacob told raised more questions than it answered. According to the boy, they had been staying with their mother in a town several hundred miles away when she had become very sick and been taken to the hospital. A social worker had told them they would need to go live with relatives while their mother recovered, but Jacob claimed they had run away because they were afraid of being separated and placed in different foster homes. The aunt they were seeking was their mother's sister, someone they had never met, but who Jacob believed would take them in and keep them together. Samuel's experience with children and his natural intuition told him that while Jacob's story contained elements of truth, it was far from complete. The boy was clearly protecting both himself and Emma from something, and the fear in his eyes when certain questions were asked suggested that their situation was more complex and possibly more dangerous than he was willing to admit. Emma, for her part, said very little, seeming to defer to Jacob's judgment about what information to share and what to keep secret. As the day progressed and the children's physical condition improved, Samuel found himself facing a dilemma that challenged both his practical nature and his moral convictions. The proper course of action would be to contact the authorities, report finding two unaccompanied minors, and let the English World Social Services system take over their care. However, something about Jacob's fierce protectiveness of Emma and the genuine terror that flashed in both children's eyes whenever he mentioned involving outside authorities made Samuel hesitate to take that step immediately. The Amish community's relationship with government agencies was complicated at best. While they respected the law and generally cooperated with authorities when necessary, they strongly preferred to handle problems within their own community whenever possible. Samuel's natural inclination was to seek guidance from his bishop and the church elders before making any decisions that would permanently affect these children's lives. However, he also knew that harboring runaway children without reporting them could create serious legal problems for himself and potentially for his entire community. Throughout that first full day in Samuel's home, Emma began to show signs of the bright, curious personality that existed beneath her fear and exhaustion. She was fascinated by the oil lamps, having apparently never seen them used for everyday lighting. The wood-burning stove captivated her attention, and she asked permission before moving closer to its warmth. When Samuel showed her how to work the hand pump at the kitchen sink, she was delighted by the novelty of drawing water without simply turning a hand. These reactions confirmed Samuel's growing certainty that these children came from a very different world than his own. Jacob remained more guarded, though Samuel noticed that the boy was constantly observing his surroundings with the sharp attention of someone evaluating potential threats and escape routes. When Samuel stepped outside to tend to his animals, Jacob positioned himself near a window where he could watch the older man's movements. The boy's hyper-vigilance was heartbreaking to witness. No 12-year-old should carry such weariness and responsibility. The second night brought new challenges, as Emma began having nightmares that left her crying and calling out in her sleep. Jacob immediately moved to comfort her, holding her hand and whispering reassurances until she settled back into peaceful rest. Samuel, watching from the doorway, was struck by the role reversal he was witnessing. This young boy was functioning as both brother and parent to his sister, carrying burdens that would challenge many adults. On the morning of their third day together, Samuel made a decision that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Instead of contacting outside authorities immediately, he chose to seek counsel from Bishop Eli Yoder, the spiritual leader of their church district. Bishop Yoder was known throughout the community for his wisdom, compassion, and practical approach to solving difficult problems. If anyone could provide guidance on how to help these children while respecting both English law and Amish principles, it would be the bishop. The conversation with Bishop Yoder took place in the quiet sanctity of the bishop's study, surrounded by well-worn books of scripture and church doctrine. Samuel explained the situation carefully, describing how he had found the children, their current condition, and the limited information Jacob had provided about their circumstances. Bishop Yoder listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful, and his eyes kind but serious. The bishop's response reflected the careful balance that Amish leaders must maintain between their community's values and their obligations to the broader society around them. While he understood Samuel's reluctance to immediately involve social services, he also recognized that keeping the children's present secret indefinitely was neither practical nor legally sound. However, he agreed that they could take some time to better understand the children's situation and explore whether there might be family members who could provide appropriate care. What neither Samuel nor Bishop Yoder anticipated was how quickly Emma and Jacob would begin to settle into the rhythm of life on the farm. Emma, despite her young age, proved eager to help with simple household tasks, delighting in learning to knead bread dough and carefully set the table for meals. Jacob showed a natural affinity for working with animals, quickly earning the trust of Samuel's horses and showing genuine skill in helping with farm chores that were appropriate for his age and strength. The transformation in both children over just a few days was remarkable to witness. The constant tension that had marked their first hours in Samuel's home gradually gave way to moments of genuine laughter and childlike curiosity. Emma discovered a passion for the intricate patterns of Mary's quilts, spending hours examining the stitching and asking Samuel to tell her stories about how each one had been made. Jacob found peace in the barn, where the steady presence of the animals and the predictable routine of feeding and care provided a sense of stability he had been missing for far too long. However, even as the children began to relax and show glimpses of their true personalities, Samuel remained acutely aware that their situation was temporary at best. Every day that passed without contacting authorities increased the potential legal complications, but every day also deepened his emotional connection to these two remarkable children who had literally been delivered to his doorstep by the storm. The house that had felt so empty and quiet since Mary's death was now filled with the sounds of young voices, and Samuel found himself looking forward to meals and conversations in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The children's presence also awakened memories and emotions that Samuel had been carefully suppressing since losing his own family. Watching Jacob's protective devotion to Emma reminded him painfully of his own relationship with David during the boy's childhood. Teaching Emma simple tasks around the house brought back vivid recollections of Mary's patient way with children and her dreams of having a large family to fill their home with joy and laughter. As the end of their first week together approached, Samuel knew that decisions would soon need to be made about the children's future. The temporary sanctuary he had provided could not continue indefinitely without involving proper authorities and addressing the legal realities of their situation. Yet with each passing day, the prospect of watching Emma and Jacob disappear back into an uncertain world became more difficult to contemplate. The storm that had brought them together was long over, but the emotional tempest it had created was just beginning to build in. The morning of their 8th day together brought an unexpected visitor that would shatter the peaceful routine Samuel, Emma, and Jacob had begun to establish. Sarah Burr, Samuel's neighbor and one of the most observant members of their church district, arrived unannounced with a basket of fresh baked goods and what she claimed was simply neighborly concern for Samuel's well-being. However, Samuel immediately recognized the calculating look in her eyes and realized that word of his unexpected house guests had somehow reached the broader community, despite his efforts to keep their presence quiet. Sarah's visit was brief, but poignant. She made polite inquiries about Samuel's health and his preparations for the coming spring planting season, but her eyes constantly swept the interior of his home, clearly searching for evidence of the rumors she had undoubtedly heard. When Emma accidentally knocked over a wooden cup while helping Samuel prepare tea, Sarah's attention immediately focused on the child with an intensity that made Samuel deeply uncomfortable. Jacob, with the survival instincts he had developed over months of avoiding unwanted attention, quickly guided Emma into the back room, but not before Sarah had gotten a good look at both children. After Sarah's departure, Samuel knew that their period of peaceful isolation was coming to an end. In Amish communities, information traveled faster than wildfire, and by evening, every family within a 10-mile radius would know that Samuel Miller was harboring 2 English children in his home. While the Amish commitment to helping those in need was unwavering, the community's responsibility to follow proper legal procedures was equally strong. Samuel realized he had perhaps 48 hours at most before Bishop Yoder would be compelled to insist that the authorities be contacted. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing their simple supper, Samuel made the difficult decision to press Jacob for more complete truth about their circumstances. The gentle approach he had been taking was no longer sufficient. Time was running out, and if he was going to help these children effectively, he needed to understand exactly what they were running from and what kind of future they were trying to find. Jacob's resistance to revealing more details was immediate and the boy's jaw set in a stubborn line that Samuel recognized from his own son's childhood, and his protective arm moved instinctively around Emma's shoulders. However, when Samuel explained that other people now knew about their presence and that outside authorities would inevitably become involved within days, Jacob's facade of controlled confidence finally began to crack. The story that emerged over the next 2 hours was far more heartbreaking and complex than Samuel had imagined. Jacob and Emma were indeed siblings, but their last name wasn't Thompson. It was Richardson. Their mother, Linda Richardson, had struggled with drug addiction for most of their lives, cycling through periods of recovery and relapse that had left both children hypervigilant and emotionally scarred. Their father had never been part of their lives, and their extended family had either cut ties with Linda due to her addiction or were themselves dealing with problems that made them unsuitable guardians for children. The immediate crisis that had prompted their desperate flight from home had occurred 3 weeks earlier. Linda had been arrested during a drug raid at a house where she had been staying with the children. Emma and Jacob had witnessed their mother's arrest, watching through a window as she was handcuffed and placed in a police car while social workers discussed their immediate placement in emergency foster care. In the chaos and confusion that followed, Jacob had made a split-second decision that would define the next chapter of their lives. He had grabbed Emma's hand and run. For 3 weeks, the children had been living as runaways, moving from place to place, sleeping in abandoned buildings, bus stations, and anywhere else they could find temporary shelter. Jacob had managed to keep them fed through a combination of small jobs, the kindness of strangers, and occasionally stealing food when desperation overcame his moral reservation. They had been making their way steadily toward Ohio because Jacob had overheard a social worker mention that their mother had a sister named Carol who lived somewhere in the state, though he had no address, phone number, or even a last name for this potentially mythical relative. The revelation that hit Samuel hardest was Jacob's explanation for why they had been walking through the blizzard instead of seeking shelter in town. The boy had seen a police car parked outside the small truck stop where they had been planning to spend the night, and his fear of being recognized and returned to the foster care system had driven him to choose the dangerous option of continuing their journey on foot, even as the weather deteriorated rapidly around them. Emma, who had remained silent throughout most of Jacob's painful recounting of their story, finally spoke up when her brother described their mother's arrest. A small voice filled with a wisdom far beyond her 10 years revealed that she understood much more about their situation than Jacob had realized. She knew their mother was sick, that the medicine she took made her react differently, and that sometimes there wasn't enough food in their apartment because the medicine was more important than groceries. Most heartbreakingly, Emma expressed the belief that she and Jacob were somehow responsible for their mother's problems, that if they had been better children, maybe she wouldn't have needed the medicine that made her sick. Samuel's heart ached as he listened to these two brave children describe a life that no child should ever have to endure. Their matter-of-fact recounting of sleeping in cars, eating spoiled food from dumpsters, and constantly watching for dangerous situations spoke to a resilience that was both admirable and tragic. They had learned to survive in circumstances that would challenge many adults, but the cost of that survival was clearly visible in Jacob's premature maturity and Emma's tendency to become invisible when adults were speaking, as if she had learned that being noticed was often dangerous. The immediate question facing Samuel was what to do with this new information. The children were clearly not the victims of simple family misfortune that he had initially assumed. They were runaways from state custody, which meant that helping them could be interpreted as interfering with legal proceedings and potentially harboring fugitives. However, the thought of simply calling the authorities and watching these children disappear into a system that had already failed them was unbearable to contemplate. Samuel spent most of that night in prayer and contemplation, seeking guidance from both his faith and his conscience about the right course of action. The Amish belief in caring for those in need was clear and unwavering, but the community's respect for legal authority was equally strong. The conflict between these two principles had never felt more personal or more urgent than it did as he watched Emma and Jacob sleeping peacefully on his couch, finally relaxed enough to rest without fear for the first time in weeks. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would complicate their situation even further. Jacob woke with a high fever and complaints of severe throat pain that Samuel immediately recognized as symptoms of strep throat, a condition that required medical attention and antibiotics that were not available in his home remedies collection. The irony was cruel. Just as Samuel was grappling with whether to reveal the children's presence to authorities, Emma's brother's illness was forcing the decision by making professional medical care unavoidable. Elizabeth Morrison had been providing medical care to the Amish community for over 15 years, and her reputation for discretion and cultural sensitivity had earned her the trust and respect of families who typically preferred to handle health issues within their own community. When Samuel called her to request a house call for what he described as a sick child staying in his home, she agreed to come immediately. Though she couldn't hide her curiosity about Samuel's unexpected house guest. Morrison's examination confirmed Samuel's diagnosis. Jacob had a severe case of strep throat that required immediate antibiotic treatment. However, her medical training also revealed evidence of the hardships the children had endured over the past weeks. Both Emma and Jacob showed signs of malnutrition, though not severe enough to require hospitalization. Jacob had several infected cuts on his hands and feet that had gone untreated, and Emma bore the telltale marks of someone who had been sleeping rough for an extended period. As a licensed physician, Dr. Morrison was legally required to report signs of child abuse or neglect to appropriate authorities. However, her years of working with the Amish community had taught her the value of understanding the complete context of a situation before taking irreversible legal steps. When Samuel quietly explained the children's circumstances and his own moral dilemma about how to help them, she agreed to provide medical treatment and to delay filing any required reports for 48 hours, giving Samuel time to explore alternatives that might serve the children's best interests more effectively than simply turning them over to the system they had risked their lives to escape. The medication Dr. Morrison provided began working quickly, and within 24 hours Jacob's fever had broken and his throat pain had diminished significantly. However, the knowledge that their presence was now known to someone outside the immediate Amish community added a new layer of urgency to Samuel's decision-making process. Morrison's professional discretion could be counted on for a limited time, but she would eventually be compelled to follow legal requirements that could result in the children being removed from his care. During Jacob's recovery, Samuel had extensive conversations with Bishop Yoder about the ethical and practical implications of their situation. The bishop's wisdom and compassion were evident in his willingness to sit-ins consider alternatives to immediate contact with social services. But his responsibility to the broader community meant that any solution would need to be both legally sound and morally defensible. Together they began exploring possibilities that had never occurred to Samuel during his solitary wrestling with the problem. The option that began to emerge from their discussions was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of hiding the children's presence or simply turning them over to authorities, Samuel could apply to become their official guardian through proper legal channels. This approach would address the legal requirements while potentially allowing Emma and Jacob to remain in the stable, caring environment they had begun to flourish in during their time on the farm. However, such an arrangement would require extensive background checks, home studies, and evaluations that could take months to complete, during which time the children's status would remain uncertain. As Samuel considered this possibility, he found himself confronting emotions and desires he had been suppressing for the 3 years since Mary's death and David's departure. The house that had felt like a tomb filled with painful memories was now alive with the sounds of children's laughter and conversation. The daily routines that had become mechanical and joyless now carried purpose and meaning as he shared them with Emma and Jay. For the first time since losing his family, Samuel was beginning to imagine a future that held hope and happiness rather than simply dutiful endurance of whatever years remained to him. The children, meanwhile, were beginning to show signs of genuine attachment to Samuel and to the life they were building together on the farm. Emma had taken to following him around as he completed his daily chores, asking endless questions about farming, animals, and Amish customs with the boundless curiosity of a child who felt safe enough to explore her world. Jacob had thrown himself into learning farm work with an intensity that spoke of his deep desire to prove himself worthy the sanctuary Samuel had provided. Both children had begun referring to the farmhouse as home in casual conversation, a development that both warmed Samuel's heart and intensified his determination to find a way to make their arrangement permanent. The decision to pursue legal guardianship set in motion a chain of events that would test Samuel's resolve and faith in ways he had never anticipated. The first step required contacting social services to report the children's presence and express his intention to apply as their guardian, a conversation that filled Samuel with dread, but which Bishop Yoder insisted was necessary to establish their legitimacy in the eyes of the law. The social worker assigned to their case, Margaret Chen, was a 20-year veteran of the child welfare system who had seen every possible variation of family crisis and dysfunction. Her initial skepticism about an unmarried Amish farmer seeking to care for 2 traumatized runaway children was evident from their first phone conversation. Margaret's first visit to Samuel's farm was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving Samuel, Emma, and Jacob 3 days to prepare for what they all understood would be a crucial evaluation of their living situation. The children's anxiety about meeting with another social worker was palpable. Jacob's protective instincts went into overdrive while Emma became unusually quiet and withdrawn, reverting to some of the fearful behaviors Samuel had observed during their first days together. Samuel himself struggled with his own nervousness, knowing that everything he had come to hope for regarding the children's future would depend on convincing a stranger that his unconventional household could provide the stability and care that Emma and Jacob desperately needed. The 3 days of preparation revealed just how much the children had changed during their time on the farm. Jacob threw himself into farm chores with renewed intensity, as if proving his worth through hard work might somehow influence the social worker's decision. He had become genuinely skilled at caring for the animals, showing a natural affinity for reading their needs and responding appropriately to their behaviors. Emma channeled her nervous energy into helping with household tasks, demonstrating the domestic skills she had learned from watching Samuel's daily routines. Both children seemed determined to show that they belonged in this place, and with this man who had become their anchor in an uncertain world. Margaret Chen's arrival at the farm coincided with one of those perfect spring mornings that make Ohio's harsh winters seem worthwhile. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of farm life, waking up to another day of productive activity. Samuel had risen early to complete his morning chores, wanting everything to appear normal and well-maintained when the social worker arrived. Emma and Jacob had dressed in their best clothes, still the second-hand garments they had been wearing when Samuel found them, but now clean, mended, and cared for with the attention that spoke of a household where children were valued and protected. The social worker's first impression of Samuel's farm was clearly positive. The buildings were well-maintained, the animals appeared healthy and well cared for, and the overall atmosphere was one of quiet prosperity and stability. Margaret had visited many homes during her career where children lived in chaotic, unsafe conditions, and the contrast between those environments and Samuel's orderly, peaceful farm was immediately apparent. However, her professional training had taught her that first impressions could be deceiving, and she approached her evaluation with the systematic thoroughness that had made her effective in her challenging job. The interview process was more extensive and probing than Samuel had anticipated. Margaret asked detailed questions about his background, his experience with children, his financial resources, and his motivations for wanting to care for Emma and Jacob. She inquired about his support systems within the Amish community, his understanding of the children's psychological needs given their traumatic background, and his plans for addressing their educational requirements within a culture that typically ended formal schooling at 8. Each question seemed designed to identify potential problems or concerns that might make his application unsuitable. Emma and Jacob's individual interviews with Margaret were conducted privately, a standard procedure that nonetheless filled Samuel with anxiety as he waited outside while the social worker spoke with each child separately. Jacob's interview lasted nearly an hour, during which Samuel could occasionally hear the boy's voice through the closed door, though he couldn't make out specific words. Emma's session was shorter, but seemed equally intense, and when she emerged from the room, her eyes were red from tears, though she tried to smile reassuringly at Samuel. The revelation that emerged from these private interviews was both surprising and deeply moving. When Margaret finally called Samuel back into the room to discuss her preliminary findings, she shared information that the children had apparently felt safe enough to disclose to her, but had never mentioned to Samuel during their weeks together. Emma, despite her young age, had been functioning as her mother's caregiver during Linda's worst periods of addiction, helping her to bed when she was too intoxicated to walk, cleaning up accidents, and trying to keep their apartment presentable enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention from landlords or neighbors. Jacob's revelations were even more heartbreaking. The 12-year-old had been stealing food and small items to trade for groceries for months before their mother's arrest, skills he had developed out of desperate necessity when Linda's addiction consumed resources that should have been used for basic necessity. He had also been skipping school regularly to stay home with Emma, worried about leaving his sister alone with their mother during her increasingly unpredictable episode. The boy had been carrying the weight of adult responsibilities for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply be a child. What struck Margaret most forcefully during her interviews was both children's adamant insistence that they wanted to stay with Samuel. Emma, despite her natural shyness with strangers, became animated when describing the safety and happiness she felt on the farm. Jacob, who had been suspicious of every adult in authority he had encountered since their mother's arrest, spoke about Samuel with a respect and trust that was remarkable, given his recent experiences with the adult world. Both children demonstrated clear attachment to Samuel and to the life they had begun building together, relationships that Margaret recognized as psychologically healthy and beneficial for their recovery from trauma. The formal home study process that followed Margaret's initial visit was exhaustive and sometimes intrusive, but Samuel submitted to every requirement with the patience of someone who understood that bureaucratic procedures, however frustrating, were designed to protect children like Emma and Jacob. Their background checks, financial reviews, health examinations, and multiple interviews with community references consumed several weeks, during which the children's temporary placement in Samuel's care continued under official supervision. During this period of evaluation and waiting, an unexpected development occurred that would add both complexity and hope to their situation. Dr. Morrison, who had been following Jacob's recovery from strep throat, mentioned their case during a casual conversation with her colleague Dr. James Mitchell, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. Dr. Mitchell's interest in their situation was both professional and personal. He had been looking for case studies involving children who had thrived in unconventional but stable placement, and the story of Emma and Jacob's transformation under Samuel's care intrigued him, enough to request permission to evaluate their psychological progress. The psychological evaluations Mitchell conducted with both children provided objective validation of what Samuel had observed during their daily life together. Emma, who had shown signs of severe anxiety and hypervigilance when she first arrived at the farm, was now demonstrating age-appropriate social skills and emotional resilience. Jacob's evaluations revealed that while he still carried some of the premature maturity that comes from early exposure to adult responsibilities, he was beginning to redevelop the playfulness and curiosity that should characterize childhood. Both children showed strong attachment behaviors towards Samuel and expressed genuine distress at the possibility of being separated from him. Chill's professional opinion, documented in detailed reports submitted to the court, was that Emma and Jacob were experiencing exceptional psychological healing in Samuel's care. The stable routine, clear expectations, physical safety and emotional security they had found on the farm were providing exactly the kind of therapeutic environment that traumatized children needed to recover from their difficult past experience. His recommendation strongly supported Samuel's application for guardianship, citing research showing that children who found stability in loving homes, even unconventional ones, typically had better long-term outcomes than those who remained in traditional foster care systems. The waiting period also allowed Samuel to address one significant concern that had emerged during the evaluation process: the children's education. Ohio law required children to attend school until age 18 or graduation from high school, a requirement that conflicted with traditional Amish practices of ending formal education after 8th grade. Samuel worked with Bishop Yoder and school district administrators to develop a plan that would allow Emma and Jacob to attend the local public school while living on his farm, an arrangement that would require some adjustments to traditional Amish customs, but which the community ultimately supported as necessary for the children's welfare. As spring turned towards summer, the daily routine of life on the farm had settled into patterns that felt natural and sustainable for all three of them. Emma had discovered a talent for gardening, showing remarkable patience and skill in tending the vegetables that would feed them through the coming winter. Jacob had become genuinely accomplished at animal husbandry, developing a special bond with Samuel's horses that brought joy to both the boy and the animals. The evening conversations around the kitchen table had evolved into a time of sharing, learning, and connection that filled the house with warmth and laughter in ways that Samuel had thought were lost to him forever. The transformation in Samuel himself during this period was as remarkable as the changes in the children. The quiet despair that had characterized his days since Mary's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose and hope that energized everything he did. The farm chores that had become mechanical routine now carried meaning as he taught skills to eager students who would carry on the work of caring for the land and animals. The house that had felt empty and filled with painful memories now rang with the sounds of family life, creating new associations that honored Mary's memory while embracing the possibility of future happiness. However, even as their temporary arrangement began to feel more permanent and natural, Samuel remained acutely aware that their future together was far from guaranteed. The legal process moved slowly, and each step required patience and faith that the system would ultimately recognize what seemed obvious to everyone who observed their household: that Emma, Jacob, and Samuel had formed a family that served everyone's best interests and provided exactly the kind of healing that all three of them needed to build meaningful, productive lives together. The most significant test of their growing bond came during a late spring thunderstorm that reminded everyone of the blizzard that had brought them together. Emma, who had developed a fear of severe weather after their traumatic experience in the storm, became extremely distressed when thunder began echoing across the Ohio countryside. Samuel found her hiding under the kitchen table, shaking with fear and calling for Jacob, who was helping secure equipment in the barn. The way Samuel immediately moved comforted her, speaking gently and staying with her until the storm passed, demonstrated the deep emotional connection that had developed between them. When Jacob returned from his chores to find Samuel holding Emma and telling her stories about spring storms bringing new life to the farm, the boy's expression showed both gratitude and a recognition that they had truly found the safety and family they had been seeking. The call that would change everything came on a humid Tuesday morning in late June, just as Samuel was teaching Jacob how to properly harness the draft horses for field work. Margaret Chen's voice on the other end of the line carried an unusual mixture of excitement and apprehension that immediately commanded Samuel's full attention. After 3 months of legal procedures, background checks and evaluations, she had news that would either fulfill their hopes or shatter the fragile stability they had built together. The court had reviewed all documentation related to Samuel's guardianship application, and Judge Patricia Williams wanted to meet with the family in her chambers the following Thursday to discuss the final decision. The 3 days leading up to the court meeting were filled with nervous anticipation that affected each member of their household differently. Samuel found himself working longer hours than usual, channeling his anxiety into the physical demands of farm labor that had always provided him with clarity and peace during difficult times. Emma became unusually clingy, following Samuel around the house and farm, as if afraid that distance might somehow make him disappear. Jacob's response was to throw himself into perfecting every skill Samuel had taught him, as if demonstrating his competence might somehow influence a decision that had already been made by people who had never seen him work with the animals or help with the harvest. The night before their court appearance, Samuel gathered Emma and Jacob around the kitchen table for a conversation that he had been dreading but knew was necessary. He explained that regardless of what happened in the judge's chambers, their time together had been a blessing that had changed his life in ways he would never forget. He wanted them to know that if the court decided they needed to be placed elsewhere, it wouldn't be because they had done anything wrong or because he didn't want them to stay. The legal system had requirements and considerations that sometimes led to decisions that seemed unfair but were made with good intentions. Emma's response to this conversation was immediate tears and a fierce declaration that she didn't want to live anywhere else, that Samuel's farm was her home now, and she belonged there with him and Jacob. Jacob's reaction was more controlled, but equally intense. He stated with quiet determination that if they were separated from Samuel, he would find a way to bring Emma back to the farm, even if it meant running away again. The depth of attachment all three of them had developed was both beautiful and heartbreaking, representing the kind of bond that the child welfare system hoped to achieve, but rarely saw develop so completely in such a short time. Judge Williams' chambers were less formal and intimidating than Samuel had expected, decorated with family photographs and children's artwork that spoke of a woman who understood the human dimension of the legal decisions she was required to make. The judge herself was a soft-spoken woman in her early 60s who had been handling family court cases for over 20 years, long enough to develop strong instincts about what arrangements truly served children's best interests. Her reputation for fairness and wisdom had made her highly respected by social workers, attorneys, and families throughout the region. The meeting began with Judge Williams reviewing the extensive documentation that had been compiled during the evaluation process. She spoke directly to Emma and Jacob, asking them questions about their life on the farm, their relationship with Samuel, and their feelings about the possibility of making their arrangement permanent. Both children answered her questions with a maturity and sincerity that clearly impressed the judge, though she maintained the professional neutrality required by her position. What happened next caught everyone in the room completely off guard. Judge Williams explained that while she was prepared to approve Samuel's guardianship application, there was an additional factor that needed to be considered. During the routine background investigations required for the case, the court's research had uncovered information about Linda Richardson's current situation that could potentially impact the children's future. Linda had successfully completed a court-mandated rehabilitation program and had been clean and sober for 4 months, during which time she had been actively working with social services to regain custody of her children. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Emma's face went pale, while Jacob's expression hardened into the protective mask Samuel had learned to recognize as the boy's response to potential threats to their stability. Samuel felt his heart sink as he realized that everything they had built together might be about to come apart. Not because of any failing on his part, but because the children's biological mother had managed to address the problems that had led to their separation in the first place. However, Judge Williams wasn't finished with her explanation. Linda Richardson had specifically requested to meet with Samuel and to see the environment where her children had been living for the past several months. Rather than simply demanding their return, she wanted to understand what had happened to Emma and Jacob during their time on the farm and to evaluate whether the stability they had found there might be something that could be preserved, even as she worked to rebuild her relationship with them. The meeting with Linda was scheduled for the following week, giving everyone time to process this unexpected development and to prepare for what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged encounter. Samuel spent hours in prayer and conversation with Bishop Yoda, trying to understand how to approach a situation that had no clear precedent in his experience or in traditional Amish community practices. The possibility that he might need to give up the children just as they had all begun to truly function as a family was almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet his faith and his natural compassion made it impossible for him to wish ill upon a mother who was genuinely trying to rebuild her life and reconnect with her children. Emma and Jacob's reactions to the news about their mother were complex and conflicted in ways that were difficult for Samuel to navigate. Emma, who was younger and whose memories of life with Linda were perhaps less clear, seemed primarily concerned about whether meeting with their mother would mean they would have to leave Samuel in the farm. Jacob's response was more complicated. He clearly remembered the chaos and instability of their previous life, but he also carried guilt about having run away and leaving their mother to face her problems alone. The week passed slowly, with each day bringing new conversations and revelations about the children's feelings toward their mother and their fears about what her return to their lives might mean. Samuel found himself in the unfamiliar position of encouraging Emma and Jacob to remain open to the possibility of rebuilding their relationship with Linda, even though doing so might ultimately result in losing them. The moral complexity of wanting what was best for the children while simultaneously hoping to preserve the family unit they had created together challenged Samuel's faith and his understanding of his role in their lives. Linda Richardson's arrival at the farm was one of the most emotionally intense moments any of them had experienced since the night Samuel had found the children in the blizzard. She was a thin woman in her early 30s who looked older than her years, with blonde hair similar to Emma's and eyes that held the cautious hope of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune too readily. Her nervousness was immediately apparent as she approached the farmhouse, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to see the children she had lost through her own mistakes and poor choices. The reunion between Linda and her children was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. Emma ran to her mother with the uncomplicated joy of a 10-year-old who had missed someone she loved. While Jacob approached more cautiously, his 12-year-old awareness of their complicated history making him more guarded in his Blinda's tears were immediate and overwhelming as she held her children for the first time in months, apologizing repeatedly for the pain she had caused them and promising that things would be different now that she was clean and healthy. However, what made this reunion truly extraordinary was Linda's response to seeing the environment where her children had been thriving. Instead of immediately demanding their return, she spent hours touring the farm with Samuel, asking detailed questions about Emma and Jacob's daily routines, their responsibilities, their education, and their emotional well-being. She observed the comfortable familiarity with which they moved through their chores, the confidence they displayed in explaining their various projects and accomplishments, and most importantly, the genuine affection and respect they showed toward Samuel. The conversation between Linda and Samuel that evening after the children had gone to bed was one of the most difficult and meaningful discussions Samuel had ever experienced. Linda spoke honestly about her addiction, her failures as a mother, and her determination to rebuild her life in ways that would serve her children's best interest. She acknowledged that Emma and Jacob had found something on Samuel's farm that she had never been able to provide: stability, safety, and a sense of belonging that had allowed them to heal from the trauma of their early years. What emerged from this conversation was a possibility that none of them had previously considered: a shared custody arrangement that would allow Linda to rebuild her relationship with her children while preserving the stability and security they had found with Samuel. Linda would complete her transition back to independent living, while Emma and Jacob continued to live primarily on the farm with regular visits and gradually increasing time spent with their mother as she demonstrated her continued sobriety and ability to provide appropriate care. The legal complexities of such an arrangement were significant, requiring the approval of both the court and social services, as well as careful planning to ensure that everyone's rights and responsibilities were clearly defined. However, Judge Williams, who had been consulted about this possibility, expressed cautious optimism that such an arrangement could serve everyone's best interests if all parties were committed to making it work. Over the following weeks, as the details of this unprecedented arrangement were negotiated and refined, something remarkable began to happen. Linda started visiting the farm regularly, initially for just a few hours at a time, gradually building trust and familiarity with the environment where her children had found healing. She learned about their interests, their friends in the Amish community, their school experiences, and their dreams for the future. More importantly, she began to develop a relationship with Samuel based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Emma and Jacob's welfare. The children's adaptation to having their mother back in their lives was gradual but generally positive. Emma, with her naturally trusting nature, quickly re-established the loving bond she had always felt with Linda, while also making it clear that she considered Samuel to be equally important in her life. Jacob remained more cautious, but slowly began to believe that this version of his mother, clean, stable, and focused on their well-being, might actually be someone he could trust with his and Emma's safety. Samuel found himself in the unexpected position of becoming not just a guardian, but part of an extended family unit that included Linda as she worked to maintain her sobriety and rebuild her parenting skills. The arrangement required patience, flexibility, and constant communication, but it seemed to offer the possibility of giving Emma and Jacob the best of both worlds. The stability and security they had found on the farm, combined with the restored relationship with their biological mother that could provide emotional healing for all of them. 1 year after that fateful blizzard night, Samuel Miller stood in his kitchen on a crisp February morning, watching through the frost-covered window as Emma and Jacob helped Linda with the morning chores in the barn. The sight still filled him with wonder. A year ago he had been a lonely widower counting down his remaining days in solitude, and now his home overflowed with the sounds and energy of a family more complex and beautiful than anything he could have imagined. The shared custody arrangement had evolved into something far more profound than a legal document. It had become a testament to the healing power of love, forgiveness, and second chance. Linda had been living in a small apartment in town for 8 months now, maintaining her sobriety with the support of both her rehabilitation counselors and the unexpected friendship she had developed with Samuel and several members of the Amish community. Her relationship with Emma and Jacob had strengthened week by week as she proved through consistent actions that she was truly the mother they had always needed her to be. The children spent 3 nights a week with Linda and 4 nights on the farm, an arrangement that had initially seemed complicated, but had settled into a routine that gave everyone the stability and connection they needed. What no one had anticipated was how deeply Linda herself would be affected by her exposure to the Amish way of life and the values that had shaped Emma and Jacob's healing. Her visits to the farm had gradually extended beyond simple child exchange. She found herself staying for meals, helping with household tasks, and engaging in the kind of meaningful conversations about faith, purpose, and community that had been absent from her life during her years of addiction. The peace and intentionality that characterized Samuel's daily routine stood in stark contrast to the chaos and uncertainty that had defined her previous existence. The transformation in Linda over the past year had been as remarkable as the changes in her children. The thin, nervous woman who had first arrived at the farm had been replaced by someone who radiated health, confidence, and genuine happiness. Her blonde hair, now grown out and styled simply, framed a face that had regained the youthful vitality that addiction had stolen from her. More importantly, her eyes held the clear focus of someone who had found purpose and meaning in rebuilding, not just her own life, but in creating something better for her children than anything they had known before. The biggest surprise had come 6 months earlier, when Linda had approached Bishop Yoder with questions about the possibility of joining the Amish community. Her interest wasn't driven by romantic notions about simple living, but by a deep recognition that the values and practices she had observed during her time on Samuel's farm represented everything she wanted to embrace as she built her new life. The bishop had been cautiously supportive, explaining that conversion to the Amish faith was a serious commitment that required extensive study, community acceptance, and a willingness to adopt a lifestyle that would be radically different from anything she had known. The process of Linda's potential conversion had brought unexpected complications and blessings to their already complex family structure. Samuel found himself in the role of mentor and teacher, helping Linda understand not just the practical aspects of Amish life, but the spiritual foundations that made their community's way of living meaningful and sustainable. Their relationship had evolved from one of mutual respect and shared concern for the children into something deeper, a friendship based on common values and complementary strength that enriched all their lives. Emma and Jacob had watched their mother's journey toward faith with the same mixture of hope and caution that had characterized their entire healing process. They had learned not to trust adult promises too readily, but Linda's consistency and genuine commitment to change had gradually convinced them that this transformation was real and lasting. Emma, with her natural optimism, had embraced her mother's growing involvement in their farm life with unguarded joy. Jacob, still protective but no longer fearful, had begun to relax into the security of having not one but 2 adults he could count on for stability and support. The evening that changed everything came during the first week of February, almost exactly 1 year after Samuel had found the children in the blizzard. Linda had stayed for dinner after spending the afternoon helping Emma with a school project about agriculture, and the conversation around the kitchen table had turned to memories of that terrible night and how much their lives had changed since then. As they shared stories and reflections, Samuel found himself looking around the table at these 3 people who had become his family and feeling a completeness he hadn't experienced since Mary's death. Linda's voice was soft but clear when she finally spoke the words that had been building in her heart for months. She looked directly at Samuel and said simply, "I love you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward or frightening. It was the quiet of a moment when truth settles into place, and everyone present recognizes that something fundamental has shifted. Emma clapped her hands together with delight, while Jacob smiled with the satisfied expression of someone who had seen this development coming long before the adults had recognized it themselves. Samuel's response came not in words, but in actions that spoke more eloquently than any declaration could have. He reached across the table and took Linda's hand, his weathered fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as if they had been doing so for decades rather than moments. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine emotion and careful consideration that characterized all his important decisions. He told Linda that he had come to love not just her children, but her as well. Her courage in facing her mistakes, her determination to build something better, and her gentle spirit that had brought new dimensions of joy and purpose to his life. The proposal that followed was unlike anything found in romance novels or movies, but it was perfect for the people they had become through their shared journey of healing and growth. Samuel asked Linda to marry him not with promises of passion or romantic adventure, but with the deeper commitment to build a life together based on faith, family, and the kind of love that grows stronger through shared challenges and mutual support. He wanted to make their unconventional family official in the eyes of both God and the community that had embraced them all. Linda's acceptance came through tears of joy that had been building for months, as she watched her children thrive and felt herself becoming part of something larger and more meaningful than anything she had ever experienced. She said yes, not just to marriage, but to a life that would require her to continue growing, learning and committing herself to values that had already begun to transform her from the inside out. The engagement period that followed was filled with practical preparations and emotional adjustments, as their blended family prepared for the changes that marriage would bring. Linda accelerated her studies with Bishop Yoda, working diligently to understand Amish doctrine and customs well enough to make an informed commitment to join the community. Emma and Jacob, who had been functioning as an extended family for months, began to adjust to the idea that their arrangement would become permanent and official. The wedding planning process revealed the depth of acceptance that Linda had achieved within the Amish community. Women who had initially been skeptical of this English outsider who had appeared in their midst had gradually come to respect her genuine commitment to change and her obvious love for Samuel and the children. They offered assistance with everything from sewing her wedding dress to preparing food for the celebration, treating her with the warmth and inclusion typically reserved for lifelong community members. Samuel's own preparation for marriage, after so many years of widowhood, involved emotional work that was both painful and healing. He spent long hours in prayer and conversation with Bishop Yoda, working through his feelings of guilt about loving someone other than Mary and his concerns about whether he was too old or set in his ways to be a good husband to Linda. The bishop's wisdom helped him understand that Mary would want him to find tightness and that love was not a finite resource that diminished when shared, but rather something that grew stronger when freely given. The wedding ceremony itself took place on a beautiful May morning in Samuel's own home, surrounded by the community that had supported all of them through their individual journeys of healing and growth. Linda had officially joined the Amish church 2 weeks earlier, a ceremony that had been deeply meaningful for her. She publicly committed to the faith and values that had already transformed her life. Emma and Jacob stood with their parents as the simple vows were exchanged, their faces glowing with happiness and security that spoke of children who had finally found the stable, loving home they had always deserved. The moment that brought tears to everyone's eyes came when Samuel and Linda exchanged personal vows they had written themselves. Samuel spoke about finding unexpected joy in his later years and about the privilege of watching Linda's courage and determination restore not just her own life, but create healing for her children. Linda's vows were about gratitude for second chances, for forgiveness for the man who had shown her what unconditional love looked like, and for the community that had embraced her despite her past mistakes and failures. As the ceremony concluded and the community gathered for the traditional wedding dinner, Samuel looked around at the faces of his neighbors and friends, at his new wife, and at Emma and Jacob, who were already calling him Dad, with the easy acceptance of children who had found their place in the world. The farmhouse that had been silent and lonely for so many years now rang with conversation and laughter, filled with the sounds of family and community celebration. The final image of that perfect day came as evening settled over the Ohio countryside, and the wedding guests had gone home to their own families. Samuel, Linda, Emma, and Jacob sat together on the front porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma had fallen asleep in Linda's lap, while Jacob leaned contentedly against Samuel's shoulder. The conversation had died down to the comfortable silence of people who knew they belonged exactly where they were. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Samuel reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. 1.5 years ago, a terrible blizzard had threatened to destroy 2 small lives, but instead it had brought healing and wholeness to everyone. It touched a storm that could have been a tragedy, had become the instrument of grace that restored a broken family and created new bonds, stronger than any biological connection could provide. Linda squeezed Samuel's hand as she whispered her gratitude for the man who had not only saved her children's lives, but had shown her what it meant to be truly loved and accepted despite her past failure. Samuel's response was to tighten his embrace around Jacob and to rest his chin on top of Linda's head, overwhelmed by the completeness of the family that had grown from the seeds of compassion planted on one terrible winter night. The last words spoken that evening came from Jacob, who looked up at Samuel with the absolute trust of a child who had found his forever home. The boy said simply, "Thank you for bringing us from the cold, Dad. Thank you for making us a real family." And as the stars appeared in the clear Ohio sky above them, Samuel Miller knew that every difficult moment of his life had been worth experiencing, because it had led him to this perfect evening, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, in the place where they all belonged. 5 years after that life-changing blizzard, the Miller farmhouse had become the heart of one of the most remarkable family stories in Holmes County's Amish community. What had begun as a desperate rescue on a winter night had blossomed into a testament to the transformative power of love, faith, and second chances that continued to inspire everyone who knew their story. The farmhouse itself had undergone subtle but meaningful changes over the years, expanding to accommodate the growing needs of a family that had started as strangers, thrown together by circumstance, and had become something far more precious than blood relations could ever guarantee. Samuel Miller, now 55 years old, had aged gracefully into his role as husband and father, his face showing the contentment that comes from a life lived with purpose and surrounded by love. His daily routines still followed the rhythms of farm life that had sustained him through decades of solitary labor. But now every task was shared, and every accomplishment celebrated by the family that had restored meaning to his existence. The gray in his beard had spread, and lines of laughter had deepened around his eyes, evidence of years filled with the kind of joy he had never expected to experience again after Mary's death. Linda Miller had not only maintained her sobriety for over 6 years, but had become a respected member of the Amish community, serving as living proof that redemption and transformation were possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. Her journey from addiction and despair to faith and family stability had made her a source of hope and guidance for other women struggling with similar challenges. The state's social services department had occasionally referred mothers in recovery to spend time with Linda, learning from her example how to rebuild relationships with their children and create stable homes after years of chaos and uncertainty. Emma, now 15 years old, had grown into a poised young woman whose early experiences of trauma and displacement had left her with unusual empathy and wisdom for her age. She excelled in her studies at the local public school, while also mastering the traditional skills expected of Irish women, finding joy in both academic achievement and domestic accomplishment. Her bright blue eyes still held the curiosity and optimism that had helped her survive the darkest periods of her childhood. But now they were grounded in the security of knowing exactly where she belonged and who would always be there to protect and support her dreams. Jacob, at 17, had become Samuel's trusted partner in all aspects of farm management, demonstrating both the physical strength and emotional maturity needed to eventually take over responsibility for the land and animals that had become his inheritance in every way that mattered. His transformation from a frightened 12-year-old carrying impossible burdens to a confident young man preparing for adult responsibilities was perhaps the most dramatic of all the changes their family had experienced. The protective instincts that had once been focused solely on keeping Emma safe had expanded to encompass his entire family and community, making him a natural leader among the young people in their church district. The most unexpected addition to their family had arrived 2 years earlier when Linda and Samuel had welcomed baby Sarah Miller, a daughter who represented the complete healing of their blended family and the future they were building together. Sarah's arrival had brought new dimensions of joy to their household, with Emma and Jacob embracing their roles as big sister and brother, with the enthusiasm of young people who understood how precious family bonds truly were. Watching Samuel hold his baby daughter while Emma and Jacob helped with her care provided daily reminders of how far they had all traveled from that desperate night when 2 children had nearly died in a blizzard. The legal complexities that had once seemed overwhelming had long since been resolved, with Samuel's adoption of Emma and Jacob finalized shortly after his marriage to Linda. The children had chosen to take the Miller name not out of legal requirement, but from genuine desire to officially belong to the family that had given them everything they had ever wanted. Their original last name of Richardson had been preserved as middle names, ensuring that their history would never be forgotten. While embracing their chosen future with the man who had had their father in every way that mattered, Elizabeth Morrison had continued to serve as the family's physician over the years, witnessing firsthand the remarkable psychological and physical health improvements that had resulted from the stability and love they had found together. Her annual reports documented not just normal childhood development, but exceptional resilience and emotional maturity that spoke to the healing power of the environment Samuel and Linda had created. Emma and Jacob's early trauma had left no lasting negative effects that weren't completely offset by the security and unconditional love they had received in their adoptive home. Margaret Chen, the social worker who had initially been skeptical about Samuel's ability to care for traumatized children, had become a regular visitor to the Miller farm and one of Linda's closest friends. The professional relationship had evolved into personal connection, as Margaret witnessed the successful outcomes that challenged many of her assumptions about traditional family structures and conventional approaches to child welfare. She often brought social work students to visit the Miller family, using their story as a case study in creative problem solving and the importance of considering unconventional solutions when traditional approaches failed to serve children's best interests. The Amish community's acceptance of Linda and her children had deepened over the years, moving from cautious tolerance to genuine embrace as they demonstrated their commitment to the faith and values that bound their society together. Linda had become particularly close to the women of the church, many of whom had initially questioned whether an English outsider could truly understand and adopt their way of life. Her willingness to learn, her obvious love for Samuel and the children, and her consistent demonstration of Irish values had gradually won over even the most skeptical community members. Bishop Eli Yoder had officiated not only at Samuel and Linda's wedding, but also at Emma's baptism. The previous year, when she had chosen to formally join the Amish church and commit her life to the faith that had shaped her family's healing. Jacob was preparing for his own baptism the following spring, a decision that represented not obligation, but genuine calling to embrace the beliefs and practices that had given structure and meaning to his adolescent years. The bishop often spoke of the Miller family as evidence of God's ability to bring good from even the most difficult circumstances, using their story to encourage other families facing challenges and hardships. The farmhouse had become an unofficial gathering place for young families in the community, particularly those dealing with adoption, foster care, or blended family situations. Samuel and Linda's willingness to share their experiences and offer guidance had made them valuable resources for other parents navigating complex family dynamics. Their success in creating stability and happiness from such challenging beginnings provided hope and practical advice for families who might otherwise feel overwhelmed by their circumstances. Emma had developed a particular passion for working with younger children who had experienced trauma, volunteering at the local elementary school and helping with church programs for autistic youth. Her natural empathy and personal understanding of what it felt like to be scared and displaced made her unusually effective at connecting with children who struggled to trust adult teachers. and counselors regularly commented on her ability to reach children that others found difficult to help, recognizing in her the wisdom that comes from having survived similar challenges and found healing on the other side. Jacob's future plans included not only taking over the farm, but also expanding its operations to provide therapeutic agricultural experiences for other young people dealing with family difficulties. His idea was to create a program where children from troubled backgrounds could spend time learning farm skills and experiencing the stability and purpose that had been so crucial to his own recovery. Samuel had enthusiastically supported this vision, seeing in it a way to extend the healing they had found to other families who might benefit from similar experiences. The photograph that now sat on the mantel where Samuel's picture of Mary and David had once stood showed the complete Miller family gathered around baby Sarah on her first birthday. Samuel's face in the picture radiated the deep contentment of a man who had found unexpected joy in his later years. Linda's smile reflected the confidence and peace of someone who had overcome seemingly impossible challenges through faith and determination. Emma and Jacob flanked their parents with expressions of belonging and security that spoke of children who had finally found their place in the world. But perhaps the most meaningful addition to their family story had occurred just 6 months earlier, when David Miller had appeared at his father's door after nearly a decade of silence and separation. Samuel's arranged son had learned about his father's remarriage and new family through mutual acquaintances in the English world, and his curiosity had eventually overcome the pride and resentment that had kept him away for so many years. The reunion between father and son had been emotional and healing for both men, opening the possibility of restored relationships that had seemed permanently lost. David's initial visit had been brief and tentative, but subsequent meetings had gradually rebuilt the bridge between father and son that addiction, rebellion, and misunderstanding had destroyed years earlier. David had been amazed to discover how completely his father's life had been transformed by the family that had grown from that winter night rescue, and his growing relationship with Linda, Emma, and Jacob had helped heal wounds that had festered far too long. Baby Sarah had particularly captured David's heart, giving him his first taste of the uncle role and inspiring him to become a regular presence in their lives once again. The story of how the Miller family had been created had become something of a legend in Holmes County, told and retold as evidence that miracles could still happen in the modern world and that families could be formed in ways that transcended traditional definitions and expectations. Visitors from other Amish communities often made special trips to meet the family that had demonstrated such remarkable healing and growth, finding inspiration in their example of what was possible when love, faith, and determination combined to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. As Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point, he often returned to that moment when he first heard children's voices crying in the blizzard and made the simple decision to venture out into the storm to help. That single act of compassion driven by values instilled by his faith and community had set in motion a chain of events that had restored not just 2 children's lives but had healed his own broken heart and created a family more beautiful and complete than anything he could have imagined during his years of loneliness and grief. The farmhouse that had once echoed with silence now overflowed with the sounds of family files in all its complexity and joy. Baby Sarah's laughter mixed with Emma and Jacob's conversations about school and friends, while Linda and Samuel planned for planting seasons and community events that would fill their calendar with purpose and connection. The empty spaces that had once defined Samuel's existence had been filled with love, responsibility, and the kind of happiness that comes from knowing that every person under his roof belonged there completely and permanently. On quiet evenings when the day's work was done, and the family gathered in the living room where Emma had first recovered from hypothermia, Samuel sometimes caught himself marveling at the miraculous nature of the life they had built together. The storm that could have been a tragedy had instead become the instrument and grace that had brought them all home to each other. creating bonds that would endure long after the last of them had gone to their eternal rest. In the end, the Miller family story had become a testament to the truth that love properly applied with patience and faith could overcome any obstacle and heal any wound, transforming strangers into family and despair into hope that would last for generations to